guys, welcome back to It's Elemental. It's Wednesday night again, and the title of the episode today is The Fundamental Alrightness of the Universe. And I am back, as usual, with Vince McLeod and Julian Crawford. Hey, guys.
Hey, Bob. G'day, Internet. Good to be here again.
Hey, Bob. Hey, Vince. Yep, good to see you guys.
Yes, it actually really is. I feel all sort of like homey. This is getting to be a routine, isn't it? All right. So, the fundamental alrightness of the universe. Vince, would you like to introduce us to that concept?
The concept is really something that Aldous Huxley came up with. He would talk about the fundamental alrightness of the universe as if it was something that he realized at the end of his spiritual journey. And then he came to think that an appreciation of the fundamental alrightness of things is really what spirituality is. If you believe that the all of existence is fundamentally a good thing, then you are probably a spiritual person. And if you don't think that, then you might be more of a materialist. And that relates to what Alan Watts said again on one of the episodes we spoke about previously, where he said that man suffers only because he takes seriously what the gods made for fun. And that relates to the fundamental alrightness of the universe, because a lot of people forget the fundamental alrightness of the universe, and I certainly did for the first 27 or so years of my life.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's easily done. It's like we discussed in the Cosmic Joke episode, that it ties in with the Cosmic Joke, because once you realize that everything is fundamentally okay, then it's a huge relief. And, like you say, the idea that everything's fundamentally all right, it seems strange because there's evil that happens in the world and bad things happening in the world, but ultimately good and evil are all part of the cosmic drama, the unfolding of events in the universe. And like we've spoken in previous episodes, in the belief in reincarnation, and this is one of the reasons why everything can be fundamentally okay, because without the ability for the soul to continue after death, then everything wouldn't be all right. There'd be a lot of suffering and sorrow and tragedy in the world that ultimately, would cause pain. So, we're discussing tonight how a lot of this is ultimately an illusion. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, for sure. I see we've got a comment here straight away from our old friend, Hello Boomer, the fundamental alrightness of the universe. Good evening, comrades. Good evening. Hello, Boomer. Yeah, I think at the core of this issue, it comes back to what we're also speaking about in a previous show. We're speaking about materialism. If you take a materialist perspective on life, then I think it's almost impossible for you to see the fundamental alrightness in anything without deluding yourself. Because if you're going to take a materialist perspective and say that you are your body, then you have to also accept that the future for you is just growing old and growing sick and then dying. And then that'll be the end of everything. So if you're taking a materialist perspective, you really cannot see the fundamental alrightness of life. Mm-hmm. You really are bound to see it as just a ceaseless, pointless struggle where everything suffers and then eventually dies. So the materialist perspective leads inevitably to that sort of existentialist misery that you see everywhere in the world today, especially in the West, and genuine spirituality is the solution.
And a big difference with the materialists is that they believe everything's happening randomly just by a pure chance. And, in that conception of reality, an asteroid could just hit the Earth at any point in time because everything's just in a random position. But when you have the idea of intelligent design or consciousness being behind reality, then you can have the idea that maybe Earth is in a proper Goldilocks zone for life by design, and perhaps everything is the way it is by design. So that means that, we're going through life living out a journey that's also by design. It's not just something that's happening with a lot of random interactions. There could be, things that support us and guide us from the spiritual reality potentially.
The materialist perspective that people have, they tend to assume that life is completely meaningless, because it certainly seems to be. If you're going to die, and then if that's the end, if to life, and nothing that continues beyond the death of the physical body, then this life really does seem meaningless. And you see that people like Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking, these highly prestigious scientists, really these men who are supposed to be telling us how the nature of reality is, these men are telling us that it's pointless and meaningless and we're all going to die, and then that'll be the end of it. We'll all be extinguished. So if you think about it that way, it's really little wonder that there's so much mental illness in the world today. If that's the narrative that's coming from who are supposed to be our high priests of the narrative of truth, then it's a little wonder that people are so sick. Mm-hmm. So I'm hoping that with this show, with all the shows that we've done so far, we can provide a healthier narrative and perhaps just be more mentally healthy, more sane than the materialist narrative, which, as we've spoken about previously, is just as crazy as the more crazy religious narratives.
Mm.
It's
and you referenced...
sorry.
I was just going to say, you referenced Aldous Huxley, and of course he famously wrote The Doors of Perception of Heaven and Hell, which was an experience in the 1950s taking mescaline. And he really credits the use of mescaline to opening up his understanding of concepts like this, like the fundamental all-rightness of the universe. And he came up with the idea of the mind at large, that once the doors of perception were opened, you ultimately realized that there was an illusion of separation between yourself and the outside universe. And once you had the doors of perceptions open, you realize the fundamental oneness with the universe. So, it's interesting that the topic of psychedelics is really key to unlocking some of these spiritual concepts.
For me, it's core, because I did not understand the fundamental all-rightness of the universe until I took magic mushrooms for the first time. And I think it's not a place to talk about that experience so much here, but you can see on my BitChute, I've got a couple of minutes of me talking about that particular experience. But that was when I learned that the body is not fundamentally what I am. What I fundamentally am is the consciousness. And therefore, like it's said in the Bhagavad Gita, this body is just like a set of clothes that my consciousness will take on and then discard again. And then once this body has been discarded, a new one will be taken on. And who knows what that'll be. But I'm not so worried about that at the time. I'm just trying to play my role right now, which is the Vince McLeod role.
Yeah, be yourself. Everybody else is taken.
Yeah, it's
we've
got another question here from Hello Boomer. I think we should probably ask it. Materialists' attempts to explain consciousness are usually absurd. I agree. What is a thought made of? Well, in materialism, you can't really explain what a thought would be made of, and that's why materialist philosophy gets so confused in things like qualia and all this nonsense. But in elementalism, we understand that a thought is fundamentally a vibration and a frequency, and a combination of vibration, frequency, and energy, as we spoke about in a previous episode. So that's much easier to explain for an elementalist.
And obviously, with consciousness being the prima materia, the consciousness contains the thoughts, right? That's the medium by which they can start to propagate.
That's right. The thoughts are part of the contents of consciousness, just like emotions, just like sensations and perceptions, and just like the feelings of the body itself. I think this is a really good time to talk about the good news of elementalism, which is if you have or want to get a copy of Elementalism, this is chapter 18. This is the good news of elementalism. I'll read out some of this chapter for you guys. 18.1, the passage begins. The good news of elementalism can be understood by considering the implications of the first and the fourth tenets. If consciousness is the prima materia, and if its natural state is bliss, then all suffering is necessarily temporary, and we all have eternal life. The good news of elementalism is that the principle of good wins in the end. Not only does every fragment of consciousness eventually overcome all suffering, whether in this life or a future one, but that consciousness lives forever. And this is the sort of thing that Huxley spoke about when he said that once you get down to the real spiritual fundamentals, there's nothing fundamentally to be afraid of.
That's right. Bob, did you have a question you wanted to get in there?
No, it's gone.
I'll point out that Alan Watts said something very similar when he used to talk about how that there's nothing fundamentally to be afraid of once you realize that you are consciousness, and that consciousness will continue beyond the death of the physical body, and that going beyond the death of the physical body, you will be reunited with some of the other fragments of consciousness that you may have known in this life, other fragments of God's self that were split into individual beings. Once you know that, there's no real reason to feel despair or horror at the nature of reality. And so you don't need to become like Dawkins or Hawking and think that life is just completely meaningless.
Mm-hmm. And there's like Huxley was talking about the mind at large, or being able to see the collective consciousness and that sort of thing. And there's also the concept of the higher self. And this was something I just knew absolutely nothing about before I took psychedelics. And it was through that experience that I realized that the higher self was a real thing and that everyone's got one. So it's essentially a version of ourselves, except it's all-knowing, it's calm, full of empathy, and the higher self knows everything that's going on, sort of past, present, and future, and it's guiding us on that path. Like you say, ultimately the good wins in the end, and people, they can reach enlightenment or even exit the cycle of reincarnation in some belief systems. So it's interesting, like in Rastafarianism, they talk about I and I. So there's two I's. There's the I, my normal self, but there's also the second I is the divine self. So it's like you say the Godheads. It's like we all have our own personal God, which is the God version of ourselves, which is essentially what is inhabiting these higher dimensions, where we're not just in these three dimensions, we're actually, our higher self is essentially in a higher dimension.
Well, as an expression of God, we have pretty much an infinite number of higher selves, as I understand it, and now all of the higher dimensions, going all the way back to whichever sort of archetype of the gods we happen to be representing in this particular world. This is a fairly lowly world, and it means that there's a good choice of higher selves that you can try and tune into if you need guidance or if you need to know what's going on.
Yeah.
I think another question here from Hello Boomer. Dawkins proposes that there is no purpose to life. We must each find meaning in our own lives. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't believe that there's no purpose to life and that it's just some arbitrary thing. That's, like obviously Dawkins is an atheist. Like when you believe in intelligent design, you believe that things were created for a reason, and the purpose is things like the soul learning and growing from the experiences of being incarnated on Earth and all the different experiences that you can have. But I don't believe we just have to to make everything up arbitrarily because it's all meaningless. Obviously, I believe we do have a purpose, and often we forget what our true purpose is, but that doesn't mean it's not there.
In elementalism, we talk about the major aspiration, which is the ultimate meaning to life, which is, of course, to entertain the gods. And subordinate to that, we have everyone's individual minor aspiration, which is whatever they believe that the meaning of their life is. So as Hello Boomer has pointed out here, Dawkins has proposed that we must each find meaning in our own lives. Yeah, that's very good. Your whatever meaning you find in your own life is the same as the minor aspiration. And there's a chapter about this in Elementalism. Essentially, the meaning of your life that you choose, the point of choosing it is to entertain the gods the most. So if you choose that you're going to try and escape samsara, well, that's cool, but you've got to judge that on the basis of whether or not it entertains the gods for you to escape samsara. And I say it certainly does, because if you succeed and you escape samsara and you reunite with God, who is, of course, perfectly blissful as per the fourth tenet of elementalism, then you may find after a short time that becomes extremely boring, and you'd rather go back into samsara again rather than having bliss for absolutely the next trillion years. So it's once you start thinking in terms of entertaining the gods, the reason why the world is the way it is, and the reason why all these dimensions and so on, why they exist, it all starts making a lot more sense.
I believe that there's a higher level of consciousness than bliss that we can't understand or perceive at this stage, and that it is actually possible as an alternative to not have to re-enter samsara, but to be able to move on into another state that we cannot yet perceive. And so bliss may become boring, but that doesn't necessarily mean that samsara is the only option to bliss. It's just that we may not be aware of other options yet.
Yeah, well, when we reach
Sorry, guys.
When you reach a higher level of consciousness, it may be possible to consciously direct where you incarnate, like you say, into different so-called heavenly realms or whatever. So there may be an infinite or a vast number of worlds or realms that you could potentially, direct your consciousness towards. And the reason there's so many, there's potentially an unlimited number of higher dimensions, which creates obviously a lot of complexity, because when you have the idea of Gödel's incompleteness theorem, which is, once you have a complete system, whether that's a religion or whether that's a scientific system, you think you've just about got it complete, but it'll be that last 0.1% where you find the system's incomplete, and that's just a much smaller cog in a larger machine. And so suddenly you're in a much bigger system, and then you realize that's just a small cog in a bigger machine, and this is going on up an unlimited number of hierarchies. So like you say about the higher selves, like when I connected with the higher self, it still had the exact same identity as me in this lifetime, but it's potential that there's higher selves with different identities, because presumably we don't just reincarnate in the same body and personality each time, right?
Probably not. Perhaps if your frequency of consciousness has not changed from when you were born, though, you might have to reincarnate in the same the same body because of your actions not having changed. But I imagine you'd soon get bored of that if you were incarnating in the same body over and over again. But these are all things that people don't take into consideration if they're materialists. You can't even conceive of the possibility of reincarnation if you're a materialist, and that's why materialism, you cannot believe in the fundamental all-rightness of the universe if you're also a materialist. You cannot escape. I think that I was speaking to somebody today on Twitter, and he was making the argument that you just don't think about it. if you're a materialist atheist, the way to not feel any suffering at the thought of your inevitable death is to just never think about it while you're alive. But I don't know if that's actually possible, because I believe that some part of your subconscious is always set at disease by the fact that it doesn't understand why it exists. So I think that you can really put yourself at peace by understanding the truth.
Yeah, that's right. Because, like, getting back to the topic of the show, the fundamental alrightness of the universe, if we incarnate from these, say, heavenly realms or higher dimensions, then we also return after our death. So ultimately, that is why everything is going to be all right, because the material reality is it's called Maya, the illusion, right? So in Eastern philosophy, they believe the actual material world around us that we see is actually an illusion called Maya. And, you know, physicists are starting to catch up with this idea that because of quantum physics, it is possible that the material world is a form of illusion, and it's actually emerging from the ether or from the collapse of the quantum waveforms.
That's why it says in Elementalism that the belief in materialism is the prime illusion, because it's the number one illusion that people suffer from. If you have that illusion, then you're fundamentally ruined, because you cannot believe in the alrightness of the universe. So anybody who has the materialist view of life is doomed to suffer. Even if they say they're not thinking about it consciously, they're still unconsciously, they know that nothing they do has any meaning, while they're just doomed to be extinguished.
And suffering is linked to living in the material world as well, isn't it? Because once you exit this material world, you can go back to a place with no suffering, where it's just pure bliss and love, you know, and joy and that sort of thing. So hopefully, once you exit this physical body, you go back to being a higher self in a higher dimension. So you won't have the really dense and low vibrations of this earth. You might find yourself in a place that looks like Earth and sounds like Earth and sort of behaves like Earth when it comes to most physical laws. But really, it's a higher dimension where you don't have to worry about the worst kinds of suffering.
Yeah. That's sort of like heaven.
Yeah, well, a lot of the dimensions seem like heaven compared to this Earth,
right.
Because this Earth's actually pretty tough. You know, we're all doomed to die, and we're all doomed to die. Probably it's going to be really painful. Like just about every creature that comes into this world dies painfully, and so that's really tough, right? But that means that if we would die and then incarnate again in a higher dimension, we could look back down on this one and say, "Wow, that was fucking something." Incarnating into that Earth was a real battle. You know, they could say, you could look back on it, you could say, "Wow, we overcame that."
Yeah, I was just watching a video before. It was about a woman who was in poor health and had a near-death experience where she basically died in hospital. And she said the moment she went out of her body, she could all the pain basically disappeared. She had terrible cancer and pain and things, and she immediately felt no pain, just pure joy and bliss. And she could see the doctors, and she could see people talk. She could hear people talking, and she wanted to tell her relatives that she was fine, that the pain had gone now, and that everything was great, and she knew there was other relatives coming, so she's like, "Oh damn, I better not die just yet." But you know, it just feels so great to be immediately out of all that suffering, you know. So, but she survived and came back into her body and recovered.
You know, the thing that I think with people like Dawkins is that it must be so sad to be them, Because if you've had that experience of God, there's no way you can unknow that. You can't not believe in God after you've met God. But these guys who don't believe in God never met him. How sad that life
I'd love to give Dawkins a psychedelic and have a real good trip with him. See if he can meet God. Say yeah, that's what God is.
Now I get it.
But I think that Dawkins may be a bit of a Satanist and sort of worships himself. He's quite smug, you see. I mean, I love the guy, but he's certainly a bit smug, I would say.
Yes, I think he's got a blind spot. He's got a blind spot somewhere in his ego. Yes.
Now I've got another good question here. Boomer. Hello, Boomer's asked, are we projecting the universe into existence rather than experiencing it? Yeah, well, that is pretty much what we're doing. Consciousness is the prima materia, dreams up the great factor in order to entertain itself. So one of the fundamental truths that you have to understand, if you want to understand that this life is fundamentally in a right place to be, is that this universe is being projected into existence, and it's not a real place into which we've incarnated only to suffer and die. So what that means is you don't need to worry about this low vibration hell realm that we call Earth being the fundamental only reality. This is just a very temporary experience, and so is the suffering here. But it's not about enduring it. It's about overcoming it in such a way as to entertain the gods. So we're really, in being in such a low frequency realm with planet Earth, it's really just high risk, high reward. You know, most of us that incarnate here will just die pitifully, but those rare ones will be able to really entertain the gods by overcoming a tremendous amount of suffering.
Yeah, and we've got another good question. Can we equate Alrightness with happiness?
Interesting. What do you say?
Well, I mean, fundamental Alrightness just means there's nothing really to worry about, like all of the things that we normally worry about. The most major thing being our own death is ultimately an illusion in the grander scheme of the universe. So that means fundamentally everything's all right. There's nothing to worry about. So I would say that it is closely linked to happiness.
I'd say the difference is that Alrightness is more fundamental than happiness, in the sense that things are still, you can still be unhappy, but things can still be all right despite the fact that you're unhappy. For instance, the unhappiness can just be part of the role that you're playing right now to entertain the gods. Perhaps they would have been bored of you being too happy all the time. So you had to suffer, you had to be unhappy just to create a bit of variety in the show that is your life.
And it's like the example of Dawkins, that's entertaining the gods, because he's a fragment of God consciousness that's manifest on earth and then has forgotten everything it knew about the divine reality. And it's playing a drama of trying to, acting out this atheist belief system. But ultimately, when he dies, he's going to suddenly realize that God is real,
Wow.
So,
and that'll be awesome. I mean, imagine if you were one of the gods looking down, watching this Richard Dawkins guy, and he was prancing around real smug, saying that there's no such thing as afterlife, and everybody who believes in reincarnation is just a fool. And then Dawkins dies, and you can see him die, and you can see his fragment of consciousness incarnate again into a high dimension, and you're watching that. Imagine the look on his face when he realizes, or you look on the look on the face of his high dimensional body when he realizes that he's still alive and in fact in a high dimension. That would be incredibly entertaining. The hubris that someone like Dawkins would have to be so convinced of his atheism, and then the smack in the chops he'd get from actually waking up in the higher dimension, that would be wicked.
It's amazing. But he was so happy. He would be so happy. I was wrong all this time, and look, there's God, and he loves me, and yay! This is much better than I thought. I mean, wow, that would be cool.
That would be cool, but that's part of the fundamental alrightness of things, because as we spoke about previously, the first and fourth tenets, you put them together, and it means that the natural state of God is one of perfect bliss, and it's only by willfully forgetting this that God comes to suffer, and God does this by breaking God's self into all these infinite fragments of consciousness, each of which we experience as something ungodlike, but which, like Julian said, really is, like our higher self truly is God. And we are just expressions, or maybe you could even say extrusions of God into the great fractal and down into the some of the real lower dimensions that we happen to be exploring. Just in the same way you might explore a cave. You know, some people like to climb mountains. Other people like to explore caves and go really deep into the bowels of the earth. Well, that might be what we're doing. We incarnated on Earth because we are going deep into the bowels of the great fractal, and we're going into a very low vibrational zone.
Yeah. It's very interesting to me that God, who is love in our tradition and understanding, that this being that is love created this earth deliberately. This earth. It's like, surely there were other options. Like, why would a being that was love choose such a tough life for us? There must be some sublime reason why he would put us through this, which is not punishment.
Well, you know, presumably God created like millions of planets throughout the whole universe, so there could be many different types of planets if you believe that there's life on other planets or in other dimensions even. So there's probably a whole range of different experiences out there, but it's believed that the Earth is sort of like a university where souls come to learn, but it's also full of challenges and full of struggle and suffering here. So that's part of what you have to overcome makes you stronger, essentially, like the example of Hello Boomers reference the last Labor government being masochistic and sadists, and you might think, say, the COVID lockdowns and everything that happened with the pandemic, you might think, well, that was a terrible thing, but ultimately the collective consciousness is evolving, and if it wasn't for that event, a lot of people got red-pilled, who wouldn't have otherwise, and people have woken up to the reality of authoritarianism. So there's every negative thing has a positive thing on the flip side as well. So, even to the extent like we're talking about reincarnation, the people who pay the ultimate price, there's potentially a safety net there as well, which goes beyond this lifetime.
Yes.
Now, this relates to another question we got from Hello Boomer. If you could live forever here on Earth, would you? Oh, that's a really, really great question. I think that's a brilliant question.
It's a brilliant question. The answer is no.
It's an incredible question. And, certainly for me, I'm happy to be here for now. Just to because I know that this is such a dense vibration in this earth that it means we've got great opportunity to increase the frequency of our consciousness really quickly. But I certainly don't want to be here in the long term because it's just too cruel.
It's hard.
Yeah, well, as your dad, the milkman's reference there, obviously, we're talking about the topic of death, but don't get the wrong impression. Like, suicide is incredibly tragic, and it's obviously, as it's a terrible thing for anyone to have to go through, and we're not certainly trying to make light of that, but believing in reincarnation actually gives people some hope as well, instead of just all of the despair. So, I'm not personally in a hurry to experience death. I think it's good to make the most of this life. But when we talk about psychedelics, that's a relatively safe way to explore some of these concepts without physically dying. But there's the concept of the ego death, and the doors of perception perception opening and people being able to see beyond this physical reality.
Yeah, indeed. Like, I wouldn't be too upset about perhaps having a few lifetimes in this place, maybe 5 or perhaps 10. But I think that sooner or later I'd really like to incarnate in a higher dimension where I didn't have to constantly stress about just being killed or destroyed by all of the many evils in this place.
Mm-hmm. You know,
but that doesn't contradict the fundamental rightness of everything. You know, just because I don't want to be here forever, all I'm saying is that eventually the nature of the suffering here would get boring, and it would be better to be somewhere else.
You know, the thing about suicide that you say, Julian, it's okay, so it's personal and it's difficult to say, but we're talking about suicide and it's hard. And then we're talking about the fundamental all rightness of the universe. And I'm thinking about, was it you, Hello Boomer, who said, is Dawkins right that there's no meaning and we just create a meaning? It's like, I know that there has to be a meaning to Carly's death. I know that. I need there to be a meaning. and yet, it's my brain can't take it in. There can't be anything good about this. And so I know at an intellectual level that I'm prolonging my suffering and prolonging my grief because I can't find that good thing. And I'm sure that when I find that good thing, I'll be, okay, I get it now. But I can't find that good thing. I you know, like, where do I get it from? Where's the fruit that I can eat that will give me this understanding of how to let go the pain and the tragedy and this is not okay. This is not okay. It's not okay. It's not okay for people to kill each other, and it's not okay for people to kill themselves. And I can't believe that I'm the mother of a murderer. It's just not okay. And yet, I 100% believe that you're right, that there is a fundamental okayness to it all. So it's like really weird.
It is. It is really strange. It's all just levels of drama, suffering and drama. And you just have to hope that you deal with that suffering in a way that entertains the gods. But I suppose, I personally believe that that's what this show is about. You know, that's what we're achieving on this show. We are transmuting the suffering that we've all gone through in our lives into hopefully what's something positive for people who are viewing. They can understand that you can still find meaning in the suffering as intense as the suffering can be. You can still find meaning in the sense that there's a reason to keep going and not to add to the suicide statistics, because the truth is most people think of reasons, but if you ask people who have attempted suicide and survived, the common theme is that they just want the suffering to end. Yeah. And that's why I think a show like this can be good, because then you can find a different way of perceiving the suffering, such that you can see the ultimate meaning in it, rather than just get lost to despair. Because you see so much of that, especially nowadays, since we've got the clown world fork going on, where our main narratives are just destroyed. You know, so I'm hoping with this we can provide something else, provide a new narrative to help people overcome that.
And we've talked a bit about suffering in the past shows where, you know, there's a difference between the pain and the suffering, because the suffering is reliving it over and over. And that's where depression comes from, because depression is linked with constantly living in the past and thinking about things in the past, and anxiety comes from constantly worrying about the future. So in a lot of spiritual beliefs, it's all about being in the present moment, because, you know, when you're in the present, everything is essentially happening in the present, and we're getting distracted by the past and the future. So to avoid depression and anxiety, trying to be in the present moment is one concept.
Yeah, Lao Tzu spoke a lot about that in the Tao Te Ching, how depression is when you live in the past and anxiety is when you live in the future. Because it's hard not to be anxious if you think about the future, because as we mentioned already, you're going to die at some point in the future. It's naturally anxiety producing. And the past always produces depression because you think of lost opportunities and what could have been and how things could have been different and how things have disappeared and gone. So it's necessary to understand that there is only the now. Consciousness being the prima materia means there is only right now and the contents of consciousness that go through your individual mind.
Yeah, and I mean, ultimately this show is not just about talking about death, obviously. It's about spirituality and spiritual awakening. And there's this concept that obviously in Christianity you have to die to go to heaven, but there's also the belief of the kingdom of heaven coming to earth. So the spiritual awakening is where people can reach their higher spiritual self while they're still living on earth as well. It's just that the frequency is suppressed, and like we've discussed, our memories are essentially wiped when we're born, so we don't have that collective knowledge. So yeah, like the fundamental all-rightness could be happening on earth, not just in the afterlife. So ultimately we have to overcome suffering on this planet collectively by overcoming the oppressive political class. I think people are gradually awakening and getting red-pilled to what's going on. So we evolve spiritually as individuals, but also as a society and a collective.
Yeah, I think that's another one of the truths that our ruling class is trying to keep us ignorant of, that things are fundamentally all right. They want us to be anxious. They want us to feel like everything's wrong so that we just submit from the terror. But if you believe in the fundamental all rightness of things, you're hard to defeat from the point of view of the ruling class. You're just someone who's going to keep going.
I was just trying to think, okay, this is on X, somebody posted, Vivid Void posted, if you're somewhat new to spirituality, you might not have learned how to spot fellow practitioners who outwardly love God or the Dharma and secretly see religion as an instrument of political power. And Richard has written, no law, election, or revolution can ever take the place of this. And I think that's it really, is that the freedom that we have is a God-given freedom. We don't need to be given freedom by a government. We just need to do the thing that we need, that we know is the thing that we need to do, without worrying about, well, the government ought to do this or the government ought to do that, because we know that they're not going to do it. And so waiting for them to do it, like we're going to get old waiting for them to come to help us. And yet,
don't rely on them.
Like this, when you have an opportunity like this to sort of step into your own power and just evolve your own community, and like, well, we didn't actually need you guys. We have our higher self. We have our own moral agenda that we can live to.
Yeah, and I mean, obviously... go ahead.
Yeah, the government doesn't operate according to the higher self. The individuals who are in the government are very much operating according to the lower self, just the bestial impulses, greed and power and so on.
Yeah, for sure. I just forgot what I was going to say there. But
it's a good question. Yeah. Can you say that comment on X again? Can you repeat that one, Bob?
Just in terms of the question, sorry.
Yes.
Obviously, there's a lot of cults out there. There's a lot of crazy religious or spiritual groups, and 90% of the time, it's probably going to be some egomaniac that is trying to get people to worship them. Instead of pointing out that everyone has the higher self within them. So you've got to be careful about spiritual groups. Obviously, what we talk about aligns with a lot of Eastern philosophy, but probably both of us got a lot of knowledge just from things like doing marijuana and psychedelic drugs, as crazy as that sounds. I learned a lot of this through tripping and that sort of thing.
No, it sounds completely nuts to the average normie out there, but that is also for me how I come by most of my spiritual insight, which I'm extremely grateful for. And it's worth pointing out that cannabis and magic mushrooms have been used as spiritual sacraments for thousands of years. So when we say we're using them, this is nothing new that we're doing. We're not breaking any new ground at all. We're just rising out of the oppression that our ruling class has pushed us into by denying the existence of spiritual sacraments.
Yes.
Yeah, and I mean, Aldous Huxley in his book Island, he talks about a society where essentially everyone in that society has tried psychedelic drugs at least once in their lives. So it's a fundamentally different type of society to one where the people who have tried it are in the minority and a fairly small minority. So the vast majority of people in this society haven't experienced the doors of perceptions being opened and, being able to see that quantum reality coming through. So, this is something we can talk about, this Island book, potentially in another show.
Yes.
I mean, if you think about a whole society, if you had a whole society where everybody understood that the universe was a fundamentally all right place to be, you'd have a much, much lower rate of fear-based lashing out at other people. You'd have a much lower rate of sadism. A lot of people who suffer become sadistic, and they find that they can suffer less if they abuse somebody else, take their suffering out on other people, and that's also part of it. But if you have people who realise that the universe is a fundamentally the right place to be, they'll just be a lot more relaxed, and they'll be a lot calmer, and they'll be a lot less greedy and desperate and clinging and reaching for all of these things that the material world seems like it can provide, but in reality doesn't actually provide it.
And so the fundamental all-rightness of being of the universe, that's kind of really another way to say the cosmic joke, isn't it? It's like, it's okay, guys. Yeah. You can just let it go.
We're pretty much back at the start, because once you realise it's fundamentally a right place to be, the only obvious and logical reaction is just to laugh about it. Like once you realise it's a fundamentally all right place to be, you take a psychedelic, you realise you're going to reincarnate after death, and you're going to be reunited with all of the other fragments of consciousness you encountered in this life, and blah, 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 blah. You just laugh. Just think, man, I was really, really worried that I was just going to end up a rotting corpse in the ground, and that was reality.
That was all there was.
And you realise, man, there was just a total horseshit story. It's fuck. It's just fuck. You have to laugh.
Yeah.
There's a good comment here from Hello Boomer.
Yes.
Being present is a curious idea if we accept time as a construct within which everything happens simultaneously.
Yeah, that is a very interesting comment, but the way that this apparent paradox could be explained is to say that everything may happen simultaneously to consciousness, but consciousness has split in the same way that God splits God's self into all these different fragments of consciousness, such that each individual fragment of consciousness is not aware of everything. And so each individual fragment of consciousness is not aware of all of the other parts of time that also exist, because according to elementalist theory, there's somewhere in the great fractal right now where there is a fragment of consciousness experiencing exactly what I have experienced, but delayed a certain amount of time. So yeah, everything, there is actually no such thing in time as time in elementalism. There is understood that time is an illusion that's brought about by a fragment of consciousness passing through the great fractal at a certain speed. It's very similar to how there's no moving image on a television screen. You just have 25 images rushed past your vision really quickly every second. So you think there's a moving image, but actually there isn't. Now, it's the same deal with time. You think there's such a thing as time, but all there is an infinite number of static perceptions which cycle through consciousness to create the illusion of time. Really all there is consciousness and the contents of consciousness as per the second tenet.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's a great subject, man. It's a really good subject. You know, I'm really glad to have this podcast. We can talk about it. We can talk about some more positive things because there's a lot of dark energy out there.
Yes.
You know, a lot of podcasts, people are talking about satanic rituals and fucking and pedovores and globalist ruling class who are going to sacrifice us all to demons in higher dimensions, and it's a very dark sort of energy. It can be at some times, you know. So I'm glad we can talk about something more positive and have a bit of a white pill for people.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, this is not quite related, but it's sort of. Laughter therapy. I've been talking about, talking to John actually, that was old John from Minds, and he was saying that the answer for depression and things is to raise your vibrations. So I'm thinking like something like laughter therapy and raising vibrations, like would that be, is that legitimate? Could you like do people go to laugh in order to change their spiritual reality?
Yeah, you totally can do it. Like where attention goes, so energy flows. That's a common occult statement. So if you're putting your attention, all of your attention, your mind is focusing on the frequency of laughter, which is, of course, the frequency of joy. We understand that to be the province of Jupiter, the god Jupiter, the god Zeus, the metal of tin. All of that represents the frequency of joy. If you can get onto that frequency, you're one step above the frequency of depression that's represented by lead and by Saturn and the very, very dark energies at the bottom of the Mithraic ladder. You can just move up to the level of joy. So if you focus on laughing, your frequency is probably going to follow that, unless you are deeply, deeply, deeply depressed on the inside.
Yeah.
I've been there.
I mean, laughing is a good thing, is a good place to be. I mean, obviously it's best if it happens naturally without having to force yourself to laugh. But, you know, you can relax knowing everything's fundamentally all right because you can turn off the TV news, which is talking about wars and depressing things. And, you know, they make you feel like everything's not all right all the time.
Yeah.
But a lot of it's sensationalized. A lot of the time, really not much is actually happening, you know, compared to what they're portraying it as. So, yeah, it's good to get away from the fear. Like, fear is one of the biggest things that holds you back spiritually. If you can lose fear, because, you know, like obviously as you reference, there are dark topics and dark energies and demonic spirits in the world, but by losing fear of those spirits, we overcome them. So
I think that comes back to the political implications that the poster on X mentioned previously. Anybody who's preaching the fundamental non-all-rightness of the universe and so is selling you fear is probably trying to get power over you some way and probably trying to direct you and make you their minion by saying, oh, the universe is fundamentally not all right because of these people who you ought to go and destroy on my behalf. I mean, that's just politics. There's nothing spiritual about that at all. And you see that it's always been the case. You go back in time as far as you like, and there have been what I call the dark priesthood, who should be the men of gold, but are in fact just criminals pretending to be priests. They're the ones pushing the idea that the universe is a fundamentally evil place to be. And so that's why I'm not a big believer in the whole concept of escaping samsara, because I believe that that idea ties in with the idea that the universe is not a fundamental or right place to be, and therefore needs to be escaped. My idea is more along the lines that if the universe is a fundamentally all right place to be, then it doesn't need to be escaped, and can therefore just be experienced. And I think that's what we're trying to do here, which is a great thing.
In the version of Christianity that I was brought up with, there is no heaven and hell. There is merely the concept of heaven and hell, and you create that in your life every day with your attitude. So in everything that you do in this present moment, you are making your life into a heaven or into a hell for you and the people around you. And I find that a really much more satisfying sort of interpretation of the concept of heaven and hell, rather than, oh, well, after you die, you go to heaven and everything's cool. That's really shallow, you know.
That's interesting, because you wouldn't hear that at most Christian churches. I mean, that's obviously much more in line with the idea of co-creating your own reality and that sort of thing. And like I mentioned, you know, like heaven and hell can potentially be happening on earth. So, you know, we do create those realities, and the other heaven and hell realms may just be where consciousness has created more positive or negative on a spectrum, you know. So it's very.
Well, there's a chapter about that in Elementalism, chapter 26, the Elementalist conception of heaven and hell. Elementalism conceives of heaven as the most pleasant part of the great fractal, and hell is the least pleasant part of the great fractal.
Right. Yeah.
And you talk about the Age of Aquarius as well, and that's interesting. I mean, it sort of ties in with the idea of the millennial golden age, and of course Christianity can also be associated with the Age of Pisces, which we're exiting at the moment, because the fish is the symbol of Pisces, and you know, Jesus uses the fish symbol, and the Pope in Rome has the fish hat and things like that. So that represents the Age of Pisces, which we're leaving and going into the Age of Aquarius. And these are 2,000-year cycles, right? So it takes 2,000 years to go through this age to the next age. So in terms of the all-rightness of the universe, like potentially in 100 years' time, Earth could have undergone a spiritual renaissance, and we could be potentially living in a much, more positive place if we're still around, obviously.
Wouldn't that be awesome?
Well, that's what I'm hoping this will turn into, this show that we're doing. We can provide the basis for a new theology, a theology of a new age, by discussing these issues in a way that makes sense to people, as not just lecturing and preaching, but just discussing person to person these philosophical and spiritual questions. You know, I think that could potentially lead to a whole new approach that might be the Age of Aquarius.
Yes. Yes.
There's a line here I think is relevant to what we're talking about. 26:17. The fact that this world is one of the hell realms is not cause for despair. It is cause for rejoicing, for herein one has greater opportunity to entertain the gods. I think that's the major lesson about the hell realms, is that they may be unpleasant to be in, but they exist because you have a better opportunity there to entertain the gods by overcoming your suffering. So they're not, it's not fundamentally a bad thing to be in a hell realm.
Okay, well, this is the book, Elementalism, by the Seven Initiates. It is very, very interesting, guys. If you haven't read it already, it's very dense. If you can't just sit down and read it all the way through, that'll make me feel much better, because I couldn't. But it is a really fantastic reference guide. So if you are interested, you can get it on Kindle as well as hardcover. Isn't that right, Vince?
Yep, that's right. Kindle as well as paperback on Amazon. But Amazon's the best place. I'll ship it out to you anywhere in the world. And it's got a lot of detail about the sort of subjects we're discussing right now tonight.
Absolutely. And we'll be back again next week to discuss again, because this has been a really, really, really interesting show. But unfortunately, all good things must come to an end, which is one of the sad things of life. And yet, fundamentally, it's all right.
Well, fundamentally, there'll be other shows. So there'll be another show next Wednesday, 9 o'clock, New Zealand time. So, yeah, tune in again. We'll have another topic. Be very similar, spiritual topic. Not sure exactly what it'll be, but it'll be another white pill for you. So tune in.
Yeah, maybe we can talk more about Aldous Huxley and his book Island at some stage, and the whole concept of the psychedelic reality. So stay tuned next week.